Welcome, everyone. Welcome to WeCAP, the Weekend Critical Analysis Podcast. I'm your host, Nurbaya Durr, and I'm here today with Dr. Ksiazek-Mikenas. She is a plant ecologist with research into native plant populations in urban environments. She focuses on symbiotic fungi and how that might assist plant survival in drought conditions, and potentially how we can use green roofs to aid atmospheric carbon sequestration. She's also my professor at Elmhurst University. And of course, she's a professor at Elmhurst University, as well as the director of the Environmental Studies program. And we're here today to talk about scientific communication with a book she co-authored with Alyssa Starry, along with illustrator C. Ryan Patterson, titled Growing Up in the City. Welcome, Dr. Mikenas. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm a little under the weather, but good. At least it's the weekend. That part's nice.
Oh yeah, loving the weekend. It's busy with finals coming up. So we're going to talk about scientific communication, and really my first question for you is, how do you define scientific communication, and what is its importance to the scientific community?
Right. Well, I mean, that's a hard one to start off with, of course, but I think that scientific communication is any time that somebody who's doing work in the science field is able to talk about their findings or just sort of their knowledge in general about scientific findings, whether they're theirs or somebody else's, to a larger audience of non-scientists. So talking about science with non-scientists. So, I feel like I do that every day. I have a lot of students in my classes that are scientists, right? Like you. I have biologists. I have environmental scientists in my classes, but then I have a lot of students that aren't. A lot of students that are pursuing careers in music or advertising or communications or nursing, whatever their field might be. And I try to talk to them about the importance of science and our current level of knowledge and scientific understanding, pretty much on a daily basis. But not all scientists get to do that. Many scientists do research and don't have a platform where they speak to non-scientists every day. And even beyond the classroom, I only might get a chance to talk with a few dozen students every week. And I really feel like that's only a very tiny number, a very small number of people that I would get to reach if I was only talking about science in the classroom. So science communication, I feel, is much broader than just teaching. It's writing articles, it's being interviewed, it's doing this podcast, right? If we were to talk about scientific findings and people that aren't scientists get to hear it, then that's great. Then that's taking what we've discovered and reaching it out to many more people, which is really important.
Mm-hmm. And something you just mentioned now is that some scientists, and please correct me if I'm wrong, may or may not have a platform to engage with the public or others that may not be within their particular field of study. Do you think that, I guess, why do you think that's the case? Is it could it be the type of research they conduct, or the industry that they're in, or interest level?
Yeah, that's, I think you're right that it's a little bit of a combination of factors. Some of that might just be the nature of their job. Perhaps they work in a lab and most of their work time is spent conducting experiments, and they don't really have it's not part of their duties to communicate those findings to anyone. But then some of it also has to do with sort of a desire and a want to do that, right? So even if I did have a job where I was working in a laboratory and I was working on collecting data as my main role, I could still volunteer to talk at my local garden club about what I was finding, or I still could a volunteer to go into a school and give a presentation, I could still write blog posts, or I could still contribute weekly via social media. There's so many things to do, but it sort of takes a desire to want to do that beyond the working hours, if that's not part of your role in your particular job.
That's such a great word, the desire. And it makes me wonder, because I know in our conversations, just by myself being a student at Elmhurst University or professor, we conduct research, and we do a significant amount together in academia and professionally. But what's your desire, like, or why, or actually, is it a desire of yours to communicate science to others in this form of science communication? And why, if so, why is that something that's important to you, if it is?
Yeah, it definitely is to me. I definitely feel like I have that desire to communicate science beyond other scientists, and even beyond the classroom too, beyond my future scientists too. And that is a really good question on why that is. I think it's just part of who I am, and like a desire to serve. Probably inspired by the way I grew up. I think I grew up in a pretty religious family, and I think I saw role models of that. My parents were always volunteering for something. They still are, even though they're not in great health anymore. They're still constantly, reaching out, doing service projects, organizing service nights. My mom is very crafty, and she would always be making things. Like, every time there was a big sale to raise money, she wouldn't make one plate of cookies, she would make 10. And then she organized things, like she makes pillowcases for kids that have to stay in the hospital for prolonged periods of time, so they get like a fun pillowcase. She's made like teddy bears that people bring on ambulances, so if they have to pick up a kid in an ambulance, whether they're sick or their parents sick or whatever, they get to have like a little teddy bear with them and have a friend. She makes keychains for people that have left mental health like in-person programs, that have like been staying there for a while, and when they finish, they get something to kind of leave after they graduate. And they go, I mean, these are just like things that she's doing now, but I've seen this throughout my whole life, and this is and so I guess I wanted a way that I could feel like I'm contributing to society as well. And growing up, I realized that was really important. So this is something that I see. Not only do I think that the scientific discoveries that I'm making and that I'm learning about are really cool, and I want to share them with people, but I also feel like they're important. Being an ecologist, I am learning about ways to help try to balance these relationships between people and other organisms on our planet. And I just feel like that's really critical. So I kind of want everyone to know about that, whether it's, a church group or a classroom of fifth graders. I was actually just talking to a classroom of fifth graders yesterday.
Wow.
And they are this group, they're so cute. They're doing this project where they're trying to, their school has like a bunch of land, and they're trying to sort of revamp it. They're planted some stuff there, and it's not really growing anymore. And so they're doing a project where they're trying to install a native plant garden to help support pollinators. And so I'm their botanist consultant in the project. And it's just really cool to see, a bunch of fifth graders get into it and say like, well, now what would hummingbirds like? And like, they have to make sure that they have got food at all times of the year. So we have to plant a variety of plants. And I'm like, yep, you guys are great. And I love seeing these 12-year-olds understand, these complex ecological relationships. They only understand a little bit of it, but they're getting there and they're excited. And hopefully this is something where my participation with them will help instill, a little bit of a desire for them to want to help grow native plants and preserve the planet too. So yeah, I think that, it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but it's not a it's not an easy story. You know, it's a complicated answer too.
No, and I think that was very insightful, that it seems as though through like your familiar, like growing up, your childhood, like just seeing examples of service and taking from that and using those experiences and those knowledges now as an adult, as an ecologist, and working with fifth graders, which is very, very interesting. And you were mentioning, you know, well, I'm wondering, is that sense of service and understanding relationships between different organisms and the environment something that's a bit inherent to those that are ecologists? Because when I think of ecology, I mean, I think of a lot of things, but one thing I think of are relationships within an ecological context. And so I'm wondering, like, for you and the colleagues that you work with who are also ecologists and maybe not, also kind of share similar values or views on the environment, and how to incorporate more people to know more and be more involved with caring for the environment.
I mean, I think there is something somewhat inherent with ecologists. You know, most of them I've met, if I've gone to these large conferences or events where you have ecologists from all over the country or all over the world, even, you can kind of tell who the ecologists are, right? And they're the people that are really outdoors. Like they have a passion for being outside, and they are not afraid to get their hands dirty. And you know, these are people that are, you know, put on hip waders and, you know, walk around the muck. And you know, they're the people that there's kind of a joke on social media how you can always spot the botanist, because everyone else will just sort of be posing in nature, and the botanist will be laying on the ground, like looking at the plants, you know. And so I think that there is somewhat of this desire to understand nature, to appreciate it, to connect with it, and then that sort of leads into this this desire to want to know more about it scientifically as well.
And you know, that brings me to the question that, you know, I often try to talk to others about the environment from the knowledge I've acquired over my academic education, my experiences, and sometimes that goes very well, sometimes it doesn't, in terms of some people, maybe they're a little bit more concerned about buying groceries, or gun violence, or other kinds of issues. So what do you think, is there an issue with how science communication is being utilized to approach, especially those that may be really far away from understanding and engaging with the environment?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that probably most of science, or most scientists, spend more time preaching to the choir, as it is, right? They usually talk to other like-minded scientists. By and large, that's what we do, right? We write papers, we give presentations, we go to conferences, we might have interviews, but by and large, scientists are talking to other scientists. It's a little bit less frequent that scientists are talking to people that are really far away from science, and even distrust science, or are against science, right? That is a lot more difficult. That's much more of a reach. And so I think that happens a lot less frequently. But I would say that it's also important. You know, it's also critical, especially if we're talking about something like ecology or environmental science. I mean, if we're talking about ways to improve the condition of our planet, if we're talking about ways to, you know, reverse climate change, reverse biodiversity loss, make sure everyone has clean drinking water and clean air to breathe. I mean, that's kind of something that inherently everyone can get behind. I've never met anyone that says, I don't really care about clean drinking water. I'm fine if it has lead in it. No problem. Like there's sort of something that everyone can kind of agree. We all want to have clean drinking water. We all want to have fresh air. You know, I don't think that a lot of people are like, well, forget biodiversity, right? But people don't necessarily know what it is. You know, like if you understand all of the ecosystem services, all the things we get from biodiversity, no one would really say like, oh yeah, I think all the pollinators should die. I don't really care about eating any fruits or vegetables for the rest of my life. No biggie. People don't really say that. It's just that you're right. Many people have other things that are in the forefront, right? Why would they spend money or time on supporting native pollinators when they don't even have groceries? They can't even feed their children, or they're afraid to step out of their home, right? Those things are at the forefront, and so usually they can be more of a priority. But I would also argue that some of the work that we do trying to like bring biodiversity into urban areas, for example, could also help alleviate some of those other stresses, right? If there is a way that we could improve green spaces in cities, it could give people, you know, a bigger sense of community. It could give people a place to go, something to do. People are outside, they're getting to know their neighbors, they're sort of monitoring their streets more. They have the ability to grow fresh fruit and vegetables, which is something that could improve their physical health. And being outside in nature, working with the dirt, working with the soil, getting to know the plants and animals in our cities are also good for mental health. And so there's a lot of you know, there's sort of a lot of connections that I think could be made that aren't necessarily being made. And I feel like science communication then has a role to play there in making this connection between where people are at, what they need, and then what science can bring them, right? Science is studying the natural world, and so we don't have all the answers as scientists, but we do have some knowledge about how things work, and there's ways to kind of bring those together. And as I said, I think it's really critical to kind of meet people where they are. And you know, if you have somebody who is very, very passionate about a certain viewpoint, it's not going to be helpful to try to change their viewpoint, right? But it might be helpful just to try to understand where they're coming from and really hear them and hear what they're saying. And I think that's a part of science communication too. It's not always the output, but it's the listening too. It's listening to like what people need. And I don't think we always do that.
Wow, what a great point. That's such a great point. To prepare for this meeting, I was reading a lot more into scientific communication, and there are two prominent ways that occurs, which is from the scientist to non-scientists, and then the second process is from scientist to scientist. And then I noticed there wasn't really an area or point where there's that listening to the public, or whatever whoever the audience is,
right.
And being in that type of state rather than talking at others.
Yeah, I'd say it's probably the least used, the least utilized form of science communication is the scientist listening to the non-scientist. And I know that you were in that book discussion that we had earlier in the semester about the book Breeding Sweetgrass, which looks at the importance of indigenous wisdom and what it can teach us about plants and science more broadly. And I think that you know, brought up a really critical point that, you know, indigenous people have been managing the land. They've been interconnected with nature for generations and generations and generations all over the world. And as scientists, we're not always listening to what they have to say because we're not asking them, you know. There are many people who do research in like tropical areas, for example, and you know, rarely do the scientists go and really learn from the people who live there, but they should.
That is very, very interesting. I've never thought about it until now, but it makes me wonder for people that live in dense cities, and they're sort of living, or they're living in like an urban environment, an urban environment. if there's types of knowledge that they may also hold about the nature there and how organisms are interacting with each other just by living in those areas and in observing and being immersed within it, that perhaps there's also some form of knowledge that could be gained from them by talking to them and knowing more about their experiences. I don't know, I'm curious, I just wonder if that's something that could be beneficial.
Yeah, well, absolutely there is. And I think that there are some movements that try to make more connections to people, especially in urban environments. So one example is a project called Budburst. Project Budburst is a plant phenology program, and phenology is the timing of when plants do things. So like when they first have leaves, when they first bloom, when the leaves start to change color, things like that. And Project Budburst asks people in all areas, and especially in urban areas, to just take note of what's going on around them, to make a note of when do you first see a robin, right? When do you have the crab apples bloom? When do you have the silver maples first start to change the colors of leaves? And so these are observations that people can make, all around them, and they can contribute to these large databases, and that could help us. By having everyone kind of work together, it could help us answer some ecological questions, such as how climate change is affecting bloom timing of certain species. That's very important. So there are some things happening. It's not but yes, to answer your question, I definitely think that everyone has a relationship with nature. Whether it's a good one or a bad one or a deep one or sort of a shallow one, everyone's got relationships with nature, and everyone could, contribute to our understanding of nature. And that's science, right?
Awesome. Wow. I don't know, but I'm feeling extra inspired right now. Great responses. And it brings me to that. So you, Alyssa Starry, along with illustrator C. Ryan Patterson, wrote a book titled Growing Up in the City. Can you tell us more about that book, what it's about, and what inspired all of you to come together to create it?
Sure. So Alyssa Starry, the other co-author, and I, we were both in graduate school, and we're both doing work in plants. I happened to be looking at green roofs as our system. We both ended up getting a fellowship from the Phipps Botanical Garden and Conservatory in Pittsburgh. And this fellowship was a science communication fellowship. It was looking at people that were doing research in plants. And the idea was to bring them out to Pittsburgh, give them some training in how to communicate science to non-science audiences, give them some practice. Excuse me. And then we got some funding to help conduct our research as well. And so I had met Alyssa. I can't remember if I met her through the Phipps Fellowship or if I met her at one of the scientific conferences. But in any case, we had seen each other at some conferences. We knew we were both Phipps fellows, and we thought, wouldn't this be a cool way to get this knowledge about what we're learning about green roofs out into the public, and especially to people that are in cities, and kids in cities too. Kids that are in cities that might not feel like they have a really strong connection to nature. Like, how could we make them realize that or help them to realize that there is a whole ecosystem right in their neighborhood as well. And so we started thinking about this, and Alyssa knew Ryan from something else, and we were lucky enough to get him to illustrate for us. We got a couple of grants to help pay for the illustration, and then Alyssa and I sort of did this on a volunteer basis as we were both working on our dissertations. And and went through the whole process of writing several drafts. I can't tell you how many. It took over a year for us to get from like the idea to having a draft of the book. And we were working on it quite a lot, but it was always remotely too, right? Alyssa was in Washington, Ryan was in Maryland, and most of the time I was actually in Germany. So the three of us to try to like get together and work on this stuff was a little bit challenging, but we got it done, and I think we're really proud of it. We have it is available to like purchase a hard copy on Amazon, but it's also available for free download, so anybody can get a free copy of the book as like a PDF. And then we had like, I don't know, 100 or so copies printed that we were just giving away to schools, school teachers. We wrote the book so that it lined up with the national science curriculum, like so it meets some of the science standards, certainly not all of them, but it is something that could be used to support some of our science standards in the classroom, so that it could be used as a resource for students. So that's been fun. We've been that was actually, now that I think about it, it seems like a long time ago. I think 2014 is when it came out, so it's about 8 years ago. But I like that hundreds and hundreds of students really from all over the country, and even in a few other countries as well, have used parts of the book or the book in its entirety to learn about green roofs. And I hope that it has at least made them think a little bit about the fact that nature could be in a city, and that there are other animals like bees that are in the city and that are all around them. And so that was just something that we wanted to do. I think it was nice to kind of also be paired with Alyssa, who had this similar desire to not only understand more about science, but to really kind of get the word out there and have a passion for science communication too.
Awesome. And I did look through and I read through the book, and for me, it's such a great, it's illustrated so well. The knowledge that's in the book is just really, really well. I was learning a lot from reading through it. And so, what message do you believe growing up in the city conveys to its main or primary readers or children? What do you think they really get from engaging with the text and the images?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, I hope that the main message is just that nature is all around us. That we chose the title of Growing Up in the City to sort of have a double meaning of, like, we know that a lot of these kids that might be reading the book are growing up in urban areas, but that also we have this opportunity to sort of like look up, and the cover of the book has a child like literally looking upwards, and we wanted to sort of give them this idea of like, don't be so closed-minded, like you can, like, there's other stuff going on, take a look around, take a look up, that there's this sort of like magical habitat that's right there that you might not get to see, or maybe you only get to see when you're on the train, on the elevated train, like if you're on the L in Chicago, you can kind of see green roofs out the window. But some people's schools even have green roofs now. If you're, I don't know, if you go to the Sears Tower or whatever it's called now, what is it called now?
The Willis,
sure, whatever.
I think maybe it was changed again. I'm not sure.
I don't know. It will always be the Sears Tower to me.
Me
but
too.
If you go to the Sears/Willis Tower, and you look out over the city, you can really see that there's green on top of these buildings, and what is that? What's going on there? So so I hope that the main message is that nature is not just something that's like out west. If you go to the Grand Canyon, then you can see nature. Like, no, it's right here. It's in our cities. You just kind of have to look up sometimes.
Wow. Oh, that's awesome. And I haven't asked you yet, but why are you very interested, or it seems to me like you're very interested in green roofs and perhaps propagating them or finding ways to increase their presence in urban environments or in elsewhere?
I mean, I think because I was that kid, right? I was the kid who kind of grew up in a more urban environment and didn't always think that nature was around me. We had a small garden, and it was my job to do the weeding. and it was like a chore, and I didn't love doing it, but I never really felt like connected with the environment. And it wasn't until I moved away from the Chicago area. I lived in Colorado for a while, and part of that was because I felt like a desire that I wanted to be more connected with nature. And I thought like, oh, well, Colorado, like that's where you do it, right? There's mountains and there's national parks, and like that's where I'm going to connect with nature, and I'll really learn about ecology. But when I was out there, I realized that, like, I don't know, it was a strange thing. Like, I didn't have a connection with the mountains. Like, I don't know, they were nice, but like it didn't feel like home. It didn't feel like my nature. And that's kind of when I started to, when I was out in Colorado, look at the really like some of the ecological relationships between organisms in cities. And I looked back to Chicago, and I just said, what's going on in Chicago? And at the time, there was a big boom in green roofs. Chicago was the leader of the most number and the most square footage of green roofs. At the time, Mayor Daley was pushing for building of green roofs. The government was giving, the city of Chicago was giving a lot of tax breaks to people that were putting green roofs in. And I just thought it was so fascinating. And it kind of spoke to me as like my brand of nature. I'm like, yeah, that's like, Chicago's my home. That's, the organisms that are living there, that's what I want to study. That's what I want to learn more about. And so that really started me on my path towards learning more about urban ecology specifically, and then green roofs especially. They're just really cool. It's like, if you're on a green roof, especially if you're in a busy urban environment, you're just sort of above everything else, and it's this little oasis of calm in the middle of something that couldn't be busier, right? Some of these green roofs, like especially downtown Chicago, are just fascinating to be on, because there's everything you'd find like out in a prairie. There's native plants, and there's birds that are singing, and there's little insects that are crawling around, and there's spiders building webs, and butterflies will come on in and drink nectar, and all that stuff's happening even though you're in the heart of the loop, which is I just think fascinating.
Wow. Wow. And that speaks volumes. Your statement is everything you said, but especially for me, you're saying this oasis of calm, and there's so much happening in the midst of the loop, and being in a lot of, around a lot of buildings that and so that makes me think of like technology, and I'm thinking of different things about technology, that the scientific communication, communication. So does it incorporate like experiences, like experiential kind of learning, but also through writing a book, or writing poetry, or storytelling, whether that's oral or through music or through art.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, one thing I would say, if you're doing science communication right, you're storytelling, right? You're telling a story. And so I think that there is a lot of connection between science communication and storytelling. And oftentimes when people do bring into their story, some of their personal connections or personal experiences, I think it can help to connect with your audience, whoever you're speaking with. If you can see that you have some shared values or shared experiences, that might be the place to make a connection with people, and then you can kind of broaden the conversation from there.
Do you have a plan to write another book in the near future? Oh,
sorry, I'm still here. Not at the moment. I don't have a plan. Yeah, I would like to. There's actually a journal called Frontiers for the Young Mind, and it's it's a journal of scientific articles that are specifically written for young kids. like middle school age, I've always kind of wanted to write an article. And then like the normal scientific publication process is you write something, you submit it to a journal, it's reviewed by an editor or peer reviewers, and then you get some comments back. And for this particular journal, their board of reviewers are scientists, but then also like a huge group of kids. And the kids are the reviewers too, which I just think is awesome. And so the kids will come back with the reviews like, I don't understand this. Like, what are you trying to say? And
Wow.
I always thought that'd be fun to write an article for them, but I never, I just haven't gotten around to it. It's kind of tough because as I mentioned previously, some of the science communication, it's not like written as part of the job of a scientist. So there's always sort of something that's competing with it, right? Like in my job, I'm also an educator. I'm also a program director. So there are certain things that have to happen, right? Like I have to make sure my classes in environmental studies have someone to teach them. I have to make sure I get my students' feedback on papers that they're writing. I have to give a quiz on Tuesday, and I have to make sure it's written. Like, so some of those things are just much more sort of pressing. And then what happens is, unfortunately, some of that science communication gets pushed off to the side. So yeah, so being more intentional about it and putting that time into my work week is challenging, but I would like to. Yeah.
How do you feel, or do you think, how could organizations or universities or STEM related jobs or can help support scientific communication, exploration or engagement with it for professors and for students as they're going through their STEM academic educational career at undergraduate level or graduate level, or even professionally and in the work field?
I think making it intentional, right? This isn't necessarily something that's going to happen on its own. People aren't born to communicate this type of information necessarily, although we're always communicating all the time, right? So I think having it be intentional, like if there, for example, was a grant for professors to engage in scientific communication, and that was something that was sort of seen as very desirable, and professors were encouraged to do it at the university level, that might encourage more people to do that. Or if in our classes we taught more about scientific communication, and that was one of the assignments that students, they got to learn about how to do it and they participated in it, then they would be exposed to it and have that experience. And I think that sometimes that also requires a little bit more collaboration. In the past, for example, when I was in graduate school, I took a class from the School of Journalism in scientific communication, and that was fascinating. I mean, I've never taken a class with journalists before, as always just with scientists, right? And so to take a journalism class, and everyone else in that class were also scientists, people trained to be scientists, and so it was really interesting for me to just learn about some of like the nuances that you would have learned in a journalism class that I had never thought about or heard about in the science field. And it's very important, like how to make sure you have an opening. They call it a lead. I'd never heard of that word, but like having a lead to start your story and then kind of capture attention, and then like how you sort of pace things and where you put important information and how you explain concepts. Like all of those things you're never really taught. But if we were taught that, I think that there would be a lot more opportunity. For example, at Elmhurst, if the biology students, had a couple sessions with some of our professors in the School of Communication, maybe we could work together to kind of figure out, well, how do you write an article about, a recent scientific finding, or how do you communicate these results from your research project to a broad audience? I think that they would have a lot to say, but we don't always like foster those connections and collaborations like we should.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, I definitely, being a biology major and an English major, and then I minor in chemistry, I've just at this point noticed that, I mean, I do think they're two very separate academic fields, but I've noticed there is like this bridge between them that I personally feel could be amplified, and where we can kind of learn, we can, each field can kind of utilize different skills or techniques, in my personal opinion. So
Yeah,
from
you're rare, you know, that how many double majors in biology and English are there? Like very,
not
very,
many,
very
yeah.
few. So for you to be able to identify those commonalities and that bridge, I think is something very special.
Um, thank you. And one last question for you, Dr. McInnes. Is there something that you haven't said that you want to impart to our audience about scientific communication, writing, ecology, the environment, anything really?
Final thoughts. Yeah, I would just encourage people that are in the science fields to make sure that they're engaged in communication. It is so important. We've seen, even like with the COVID pandemic, there's been a ton of misinformation, or people that one of my pet peeves is people that are like, "Oh, I've done some of my own research," and and I'm like, "What? So you Googled something? Like, that's not what scientific research is. It's not the same thing." And in today's world, you could sort of get information from anyone that will back up any opinion you have, right? I could literally go right now and probably find a dozen sources that confirm that the world is flat. And that is clearly not accurate, right? So there's stuff out there that you can kind of get to confirm any sort of wackadoo idea you have. And so I think that because of that, scientific communication is even more important. Like it's critical, because 100 years ago we didn't have a source of misinformation. It couldn't spread so quickly, so far like it can today. And so yeah, I would encourage people that are in the science field to intentionally work on science communication, and then I would just encourage people in other fields as well to just to try to foster those connections, right? There are so many people that are like artists that can have hugely powerful impacts on society, and if they choose whatever their subject matter is, if they have an option to choose something that is about ecology or in the environment, like that, I think that can be really really powerful, and that really helps to connect with people. So I guess I encourage everyone to kind of get involved in science communication, no matter what your background is. I know I'm as the director of the environmental studies program, I'm always trying to get people to add a minor in environmental studies. I'm always like selling that, and like it doesn't matter. Like if you're in advertising, great, we need you to understand like the environment, like so that you're not focusing on greenwashing practices. Like, oh, you're in business, awesome. You need to learn how to make your business more sustainable. Oh, you're in fine arts. Your focus is on sculpture. Excellent. Like, how could you get people to appreciate nature and the state of our environment through your work? But there's always these applications, and that's all types of science communication, right? So I think I'll stop there. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much. This has been a really informative, insightful, and just like a lovely experience talking to you. And thank you all. This is Dr. McInnes, and